as we are in our series of how supporting small businesses during the pandemic and providing resources to identify ways that we as cities, policymakers, small business advocates, technical assistance providers can ensure that we are putting resources out to support our small businesses. For today, you won't see all of our lovely faces, outfits, clean, shaven cuts, for this morning. What I will try and do though is share my screen. I'm Tanua Thrash-Inta, the Executive Director of Los Angeles List. And for this morning, we're going to have a two-part conversation. The first part of our conversation will be focused on really the concept of how do we provide a call for data response for small businesses right now? What does that mean as a city? What data can we collect? What can we learn from that? And how can that use us to inform better policy? And then the second part of the conversation, we're going to focus on the needs of a small business subset that often is overlooked and doesn't have access to additional resources in order to sustain itself. And that's really our multifamily rental apartment owners. And so we've got folks from three different perspectives coming in to talk about that. For this morning, as you know, the Local Initiative Support Corp is a nonprofit that focuses on bringing capital and capacity building to communities. On our website at www.list.org Los Angeles, you'll find our small business toolkit for local governments. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring us into the next part of our conversation. Our toolkit on our website actually has 7 or 8 different policy options and opportunities to support small businesses. One of which is called is a call for data. This concept is really focused on the fact that during this time, it's really critical that we learn how to access information from our small businesses, and we take the time to really get a sense of what's happening out there. We have looked around at several different cities and organizations to see who's doing just that. With that information, we can create a database of small businesses, establish a direct line of contact with those who are most impacted by the pandemic. And one of the things that you're going to hear today is that sometimes those businesses who are not coming in and sharing what's happening with them also tells us something about who's connected and what their experience is like. We believe that this kind of data and information will arm local governments with a robust set of resources that are and sources of data that's backed by real-time information that can be leveraged for external reports, philanthropic requests, as well as internal planning and processes in order to figure out where should we be putting resources at this time. So I'm really excited to have from the special projects, as a special projects officer for the Economic and Workforce Development Department in the City of Oakland, Marisa Raya joining me for today. Marisa, can I hear from you? Say a little good morning. I know we can't see you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me, Tanua. And yes, I am with the City of Oakland, California's Economic and Workforce Development Department. I'm sitting here in a beautiful castle overlooking the sparkling bay and Golden Gate Bridge. I'm just gonna make that up since you can't see me.
That's great. It's nice to give us a visual.
Nice visual. And I manage the City of Oakland's economic development strategy. I handle most of our economic and business data and do a lot of interdepartmental policy development work.
Great. So Marisa, thanks for being on today. So where we want to talk with you a bit about is the fact that when COVID-19 hit, we know, of course, that cities have been trying to figure out how to connect with, reach out to, and see what they can do to support small businesses. And one of the things that you all decided as a city is to go ahead and put out a survey to try and understand what's happening to small businesses in the city. Tell us a little bit behind, how you came to that conclusion to put out the survey, and what you were hoping to achieve with it.
Yeah, the survey decision was made by my colleague, Micah Hinkle, who runs our business development division. And I think he just understood right away that we were going to need data on the impacts of shelter in place to even start to think about how best to respond and support our small business community in Oakland. So we very quickly put up a survey. It's in multiple languages. And in Oakland, we almost always do everything in Chinese, Spanish, and Vietnamese, as well as English. And it just asks small businesses if they have been impacted by shelter in place, and many businesses were still open, such as grocery stores, but also took the survey just what the impacts have been to their revenue, to their number of employees. They included their industry sector, their zip code, what type of assistance they thought would be most helpful to them. So, grants, loans, marketing assistance, tech support, etc. And then finally, they had an option if they wanted a member of our staff to call them and provide support for how to just keep their business surviving through the coronavirus crisis. And we had, I think, 1,200 businesses that took the survey and requested support from staff. So I've spent a lot of my time over the last few weeks managing that phone banking outreach. We have talked to all of those businesses that took our survey, learned more about where they're at, understood quickly who was having difficulties accessing stimulus funds. And maybe I'll just stop there and let me know if there's more that you'd like to hear about that.
I mean, there was a lot to unpack there. So you had one, you put it out online. So, that's one thing, but you've also put it in multiple languages to make sure that as a city, it sounds like you routinely put things in various languages to make sure you reach a variety of businesses. So what about from a timing perspective? So you put this out pretty quickly in the process. What's been the continued response from businesses over the last few weeks?
Yeah, so we put it up, I think, like on March 15th or March 16th, as soon as we knew that we were all going into shelter in place. In the first couple of weeks of shelter in place, we had over 100 responses every day. On March 18th, I think we had 350 responses. And then we started, we also were fortunate in that the Haas, the business school up here at UC Berkeley, some of the professors from the Sustainable MBA program were reaching out to us, and one of them offered to analyze our survey data for us. So I was anonymizing and sending her the survey results, and we were able to really quickly turn around and put important data points into, for example, workforce grants that we were applying for, because we could say where the bulk of the job losses were in the first few weeks. Now the intake has dropped to probably less than 5 businesses a day. I still do like town halls with council members where I'm talking about our business resources and inviting people to take our survey if they want one-on-one help from us. But we also shifted, we saw in the first few weeks of survey response that the lowest response rates were from zip codes in East Oakland, not the deepest part of deep East Oakland, but like the 80s and the avenues. And so we started doing targeted or proactive outreach to that area, working with the council member from that district.
So Marisa, the important part here is that what the survey was telling, the survey was telling you a lot about, what business needs, where people had needs, where they were coming from, but it also showed you where there really were very low numbers of businesses reporting in and sharing survey results. And so those, tell us the characteristics of you were finding you weren't getting very many results.
Well, I think we know from other economic data sources that Oakland, the majority of businesses in Oakland are owned by people of color, but for Black and Latinx and Native-owned businesses, the employee and revenue rates are much lower. And those businesses, especially Deep East Oakland, which is far away from Oakland City Hall, where we have our walk-in business assistance center, we know going into this that those business owners are going to be probably the least likely to have a cozy banking relationship that would have allowed them to access PPP stimulus funds in the first round, and are less likely to contact the city. So we worked with community partners that support small businesses. We had a really cool organizing effort right off the bat in the Black business community in Oakland, where several different Black business support networks came together and formed the Black Economy Rapid Response Network. And we reached out to them to see if they wanted to use the survey and resource script that we had developed for businesses that had contacted the city directly and work with us and a bunch of MBA students who volunteered to support our small business outreach effort to call their members and check in on them and see how they were doing. So they stepped up with that right away. They took our Excel-based tools and improved on them and made a whole virtual phone banking platform. And I'm really excited that they're going to be using that tool moving forward.
Well, it's great that you had the connection with the university and the business school. So you've got, both faculty and students who are available, some of which it sounds like, even had some experience with working with these types of businesses, having cultural and language skills that could be helpful. It sounds like the partnership with the university and the business school has been really, really helpful for the city.
It's been really amazing, and it was so encouraging. I started talking to just a couple of people, and then they thought they could get maybe 13 MBA students who are all also sheltering in place to volunteer. And we set up a training call, and I had 26 students show up. And I was just so moved that they were really excited to reach out to business owners in Oakland and help them understand how to apply for stimulus funds, how to apply for pandemic unemployment assistance, what that was, which grants were available, other things they could do to keep cash flow. And I think there are a lot of agencies that are offering support if you call them. Our local SBDC partners, you can call them for help. Even Cal has a great program at the law school where you can call a student and get advice on the stimulus funds. But I feel that proactive outreach was really necessary for a lot of our business owners who just wouldn't know who to call, or wouldn't probably take that step because they've been turned down for assistance before, and just wouldn't expect that resource would be of service for them.
Yeah, those are the businesses that we're calling the ones that aren't necessarily hyper connected. So they may not be connected to an association. They may not be connected to a chamber. They may not be connected to their local elected office. And yet they're providing great services and jobs in our communities. If you've got questions for Marisa, we're going to ask you to definitely put those in the chat box. I'll have my team members help me moderate those because we'll go to questions in just a few minutes. Marisa, now, you started out this concept of we know we needed data, or at least, you and a couple of team members who you credited. So now that you have gotten to the point where you've gotten the survey out, it's online, it's in multiple languages, you've started to learn some various things from the data itself, what it tells you and what it's not telling you. What would you say, like if you had some thoughts about sort of lessons learned in the implementation of this program, what might some of those be?
Well, when we shifted to doing the proactive outreach, we added a couple of questions, like when it became really clear that in order to apply for funding, you needed internet access. We added a question about, whether you have access to a computer and internet. The thinking there was if we had a certain number of business owners who didn't, that would be an easier thing for us to fundraise for. And we also, we stood up a small grant program in Oakland that we used private fundraising. And that produced a second data set. So we put out a grant opportunity of $5,000 for very low income business owners. And we had over 1,000 applicants for that grant. And I think a good move we made in that case was partnering with the local CDFI Working Solutions to administer that program and very quickly produce a data analysis of who the applicants were. That one collected race and ethnicity information. We don't ask for that in the coronavirus impact survey on our webpage, but that's really important information for us to see the demand for grants from Black, Latinx, and Asian owners. Most of our grants went to women-owned businesses, and it became an important fundraising tool. So we were able to go out and fundraise and get an additional $500,000 for that grant program.
That's exciting. And exciting to know that this was, collected in real time. Philanthropy can feel good knowing that these are real needs that we're collecting, right now, live, getting a sense of what's happening in the community. I think that's great.
Thank you.
So, Marisa, it doesn't appear that we have any questions right now. And, people may not find as riveting as I do this concept and you and I calling for data and why that's important and how that can help inform inform effective policy. So Marisa, we've got just a couple more minutes. Just wanted to make sure, was there anything else that you wanted to share with our audience and those who might be listening to this later regarding launching such a program like this, some of the, pitfalls and the wonderful sort of ahas that came out of doing this kind of program and how you think this will inform your COVID-19 response going forward?
Sure. Well, we are about to start a recovery advisory council here in Oakland, and I think we're able to certainly start with some framing around which types of businesses are struggling the most. Like I noticed in my calls, the businesses, of course, and I think this is kind of a no-brainer, but it just helps so much to actually hear directly from business owners themselves. Businesses that run like arcades or gyms and places that won't be able to open even in phase 2 of the coming out of shelter in place are in real dire straits as far as their ability to pay. They can't keep paying on rent when they have no income. So I think that this is going to be really good information. And I've noticed both for myself and my husband runs a nonprofit that's also working on crisis response. The networks that we create become essential to distribute resources. So we see that especially, for example, for undocumented residents, they can't access stimulus funds, they can't access unemployment. So the city can, come step in and generate a local fund, but we also need a way to distribute that. And we need to have networks with, in my case, undocumented business owners. We have a pretty good network of food vendors in Oakland and a good idea of, who's undocumented and who is able to put a social security number on an application for funding. So those networks just become super important as we start to try to shift resources or generate resources to fill the gaps of people who haven't gotten any support yet.
Yeah, that's important to bring up. There are these networks that exist, but oftentimes, if you're not in it, you have no idea that that's what's happening. So it's great that we try and connect them to the opportunities that the city is looking to create. Looks like we've got one question or a question out there. Emma, I'm going to ask you to ask the question.
Sure, thank you. So we have one question from Eric Yost from HUD. He asks, for your survey and delivery efforts, how are you measuring your success? And can you speak to any of your key metrics?
I think, the only measure of success I guess we have now is how many people get funding. And we have not, for only certain groups do we have that implemented, where we can make a follow-up call, for example, a week later. Everyone that takes our survey gets a weekly email with the latest updates on the very rapidly shifting world of financial resources that are available. That also goes out in multiple languages. But I think the real success is if the business stays open, and also if they actually receive some form of financial assistance. We have a little bit of that information so far, but I think we would probably do like a follow-up where we request. I don't think we can call this many businesses again, but I think we would do an email request where people let us know whether or not they received funding. And I have gotten calls from people who I've talked to directly on the phone to let me know, oh yes, I got my PPP loan yesterday, but I have a question about how do I, what do I do with it, et cetera? How do I make sure it gets forgiven? So that's probably our biggest success measure.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for the question out there. Marisa, thank you again for joining us this morning. We're so excited and glad that your team had the foresight to put this website together and the survey together. And it sounds like you've been able to help a number of businesses that, frankly, otherwise we would not even known that they were not well connected to resources that we might have assumed. Thanks for joining us this morning. And we'll look forward to additional conversations.
Thank you.
So for this second half of our conversation for today, we will specifically get into talking about what it means to be a property owner, to be a rental housing provider in today's market. As the Local Initiative Support Corporation and as an entity that works every day to make sure that there's capital and resources available to build as much affordable housing as possible in the Los Angeles County and surrounding county landscapes, we are very compassionate about the needs of local renters as they are hard hit by the COVID-19 crisis and not being able to have the income in order to sustain themselves and most certainly to pay rent. One of the things that cities have done across the country and certainly across the state and across the region is enact rent moratoriums. Those moratoriums have real consequences, not only for those who are looking to exercise them, but for the homeowners as well. I'm sorry, property owners as well, who have to also pay mortgages and manage various bills in order to get through this crisis. And one of the things that we had learned as LISC in looking at how to respond to this COVID-19 crisis is that there are a particular type of small businesses, particularly those that receive investment income from rental property. So those who own multifamily property or other kinds of property who happen not to qualify for things like the SBA products out there. So as you can imagine, that puts property owners in a very tough circumstance who are already in the business of being, hopefully to the extent that we're interested in working with those who are good property owners, good to their renters and working with them. But to the extent that there's not resources even to help them, that makes it difficult for them to continue to offer quality, affordable housing. For today, we're joined by three panelists who are going to give a couple of different perspectives on what it means to be a rental property owner in today's environment. We're going to talk about what are some of the challenges that they're experiencing, as well as some ideas that they have right now about how we sustain and support our rental housing property owners. We're joined today by Jackson. Andrea is a property owner. She actually lives in the facility that she owns and operates, and we'll talk about what it's like to be a very small property owner in today's circumstances. Daniel Coulson. Daniel is head of the Apartment Association, and we'll talk about what it means as someone who is leading the efforts throughout the region and making sure that property owners are considered in policies going forward. And we also have Jackie Dupont-Walker, who is an affordable housing developer, runs a nonprofit organization, and has the kinds of properties that have a number of restrictions on them with regard to who can be rented to, how much income they can have, and what impacts this COVID-19 might have in a highly regulated and compliance environment. So all three of you, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'd like to give each of you just about 90 seconds to just kind of frame for yourselves sort of who you are, who you're representing, and how you're coming to this conversation. So maybe Andrea, you want to start us out and say a little quick welcome?
Well, thank you for this opportunity to participate in this very important conversation. Again, my name is Andrea Jackson, and I'm here on behalf of the Coalition for Small Rental Property Landlords. And I want to acknowledge LISC for your efforts to collect data around the impact of COVID-19 on small property owners. We're all small mom and pop property owners. And as you indicated, I live in Los Angeles in the Crenshaw Manor area. I live in one of my units. And one of the major concerns we all have, is that as the mayor and the governor executed their shelter-in-place plans, there were all these pronouncements about how there was going to be rent and eviction moratorium, but landlords were left out of that conversation, and there were no recourses or resources that were mentioned that we could tap into during this period when, if our tenants were impacted by the COVID-19 and could not pay their rent, what we could do to supplement their income. I mean, oftentimes we rely on the tenants' income to pay our mortgages, to pay our service providers, our gardeners, our plumbers, our electricians when things go wrong in our facilities. And so it's just really created a situation, for us mom and pop landlords, because with the pronouncement was the fact that tenants could use up to 12 months to repay their unpaid rent balances. And in that interim, there was no explanation, no recourse provided as to what we could do in that interim period. I mean, we can't just not pay our mortgage. So right. That's a major concern of our group. And
so Andrea, we're going to get into some of those, but thanks for us all of that background. So we have a good sense of who you are. You've got, a small apartment complex, you're living in that complex and trying to figure out, along with everyone else, how to manage through this storm right now. So I'm going to bring in Daniel, if he would. Dan, if you would introduce yourself, about 90 seconds to go over, who you are, your members, and what who you represent.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you for having me on. And I just want to correct one quick thing. There is no rent moratorium. What we do have are rent increase freezes and eviction moratoriums. There's a clear distinction. I just want to make sure that I put that out there. But my name is Dan Coulson. I'm the executive director of the Apartment Association of Greater LA, and we've been around for 103 years. And our mission in life is to increase the professionalism among rental housing providers throughout Southern California. And we've been doing that, as I said, for 103 years. I am a CPA by training, started at Ernst & Young and spent most of my career as a chief financial officer in the network radio business. And for about 3.5 years before coming to the Apartment Association, I was the CFO of the owner of the Beverly Hilton and was part of building a Waldorf Astoria at the corner of Wilshire and Santa Monica Boulevard. I've also been a planning commissioner for 6 years in the city of Beverly Hills and was chair of the planning commission. And over the years, through a lot of hard work, my wife and I sacrificed and saved money, and we bought a couple of rental properties that we hope to hold on to in order to help supplement our retirement someday. And that's what we did. And in fact, like the previous panelist, my wife and I own a 4-unit building and we live in one of the units. We sold our single family home and bought this apartment building so we'd have some rental income to supplement our housing and lower the cost of our housing because, like renters are experiencing in California, housing is expensive for everybody. And so we did that, and an opportunity came up about 2.5 years ago at the Apartment Association. And because I have a little bit of skin in the game, I jumped at the opportunity and took a pay cut and joined, the nonprofit Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles. And I'm very passionate about what we do and helping other people who are today struggling managing their investments due to a number of reasons, including COVID-19 and lots of regulations that are constantly thrown at them. But anyway, thank you for having me on.
Dan, thanks so much for sharing that and for sharing your personal story and journey towards entering the field of owning housing and as well as your role as being an advocate as part of that. Look forward to getting into the conversation. We're also joined by Jackie Dupont-Walker. Jackie's the executive director of the Ward Economic Development Corporation and owns and operates hundreds, if not thousands of units of affordable housing throughout Los Angeles. Jackie, thanks for joining us. Please, some of our folks may know you, but others may not. Tell us how you come to this conversation.
Good morning to Noah and to fellow panelists. It is a wonderful opportunity to have a dialogue because that is truly how we make effective change. I represent Ward Economic Development Corporation in this conversation. And you can tell from the title that housing is one of our products, but not our total focus. We look at economic development, which is encouraging small businesses, especially legacy businesses in our target and service area. We also look at how we can look at human capital. So leadership and neighborhood development is a part of what we do. How do we encourage people and support people in being engaged with government, making change, maintaining and sustaining a neighborhood that they can be proud of living in and comfortable living in? Today's conversation affects us as a provider of affordable housing, and all of our housing is 100% affordable. And looking at how there's been apparently a one-size-fits-all policy put in place. And all of us can appreciate that there's never one policy that can fit every situation. But when we are at the table to discuss policy, then we can find themes and we can create win-win situations for everyone. So as an affordable housing provider, we look forward to the opportunity to talk to our residents. Other people call them tenants, but to talk to our residents when there are issues. The coronavirus is one of the most sustained occasions when people are unable to afford rent and must look at their total revenue stream. But it is not the first for us as affordable housing developers, and we normally work with our residents around plan. What has happened in this environment in an effort to try to stave off and react to a situation that none of us thought we'd experience in our lifetime. Some of the policy has created win-lose positions. We look forward to this conversation as perhaps leading to that win-win that we think will make it possible for all of us to survive in this environment. So I look forward to the conversation here and to any follow-up that anyone wants to have with us.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all three of you for being on and your connection to this topic. Dan, you wanted to make sure that I clarified for people. I called it a rent moratorium, but it is a rental eviction moratorium. I was corrected as you corrected me as saying.
Yeah, there's two things going on. There's a eviction moratorium right now where owners are not able to evict renters for non-payment of rent if they've been adversely affected by COVID-19. That's one thing. And there's a lot of different ways the law states that renters could be impacted by COVID-19. And that can include job loss of hours, actually coming down with COVID-19 or caring for a family member with COVID-19 or childcare needs. And there are often other criteria under that. And then the other thing we're seeing is that there's a rent increase freezes right now where cities like Los Angeles are forbidding owners to increase rent for up to 12 months after the emergency order is lifted.
Okay, thanks for that. I appreciate it. So Andrea, getting back to the conversation that we were starting to have, with the eviction moratorium, I know that when April 1st came, for example, and now we've got May 1st has come, a lot of property owners were very concerned about, what happens if someone is not able to pay their rent. What impact is that going to have on the property owner? And you mentioned to us, what that means for you. So that means what for you, Andrea? If somebody is not able to pay their rent, what impact is that having on you as a property owner?
So the impact on us as mom and pop property owners is that we have to sit down with our tenant, have a conversation with our tenant. It's very important during this period to keep the lines of communication open between tenants and landlords, and to get a clear understanding of whether or not they will be able to pay a portion of their rent or none of their rent at all. And we have to simply take their word for it. And if they are unable to pay their rent, then we set up a repayment plan with them. But in the interim, that means that as a landlord, you can't count on that rent for that particular month. So as a collective, our collaborative group, everyone just has taken, like a collective, like we're all holding our breath that, the tenants will pay their rent. It's May 6th now. Some tenants have paid, some have not. And so it's a situation where we all just have to wait and see whether or not our tenants are going to pay. Luckily, all my tenants paid. Hallelujah. I'm very happy, but that's not the case with all of the individuals.
And that probably speaks to the fact that you've got strong relationships with your tenants. They enjoy living there. As someone who lives there as well, probably, works really hard as well to maintain the property. But it speaks to the relationship you have with your tenants. Jackie, you and I have talked about the fact that communication is so critical and so key to what's happening right now. And some people might hear what's being communicated out is that, maybe I don't pay my rent, but part of what the other communication that I'm really glad that Andrea pointed out is that we really want people to be communicating with those who are providing housing for them so that we can find solutions going forward. Talk a little bit about communication, Jackie, and what it means for you and the kind of, you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of folks that you're working with.
To know it is extremely important, and hopefully it's a continuation for everyone but certainly in the coronavirus environment, it has to be new behavior. For us, as soon as we heard many not-for-profit providers got together and talked about how we could help people through the time, one of the first things we talked about is what were people likely to sacrifice. And we know that we don't want people to sacrifice their meds. We have a lot of seniors. That was extremely important. We don't want people to sacrifice eating well. And so as we called around to see what resources were, we were pleased that our elected officials stepped up. And for almost all of our residents, there's the opportunity for them to get at least one meal a day that someone else provides. Other elected officials provided produce, which means you can reduce the amount of money you were paying at the market. But more than anything else, it was the kind of daily communication. How are you? What is happening, even for those who might be embarrassed. And, you know, a lot of our people are embarrassed to say they can't do. And just opening that communication is extremely important. What is troubling is sometimes the announcements made over media are soundbite announcements. And so people hear part of it. So it becomes really interesting when someone who has income that was not impacted at all by COVID-19 would just arrive at the manager's office and say, oh, I heard on the radio I don't have to pay rent, so I can't pay rent. And you go, what? Well, now we have taken away the opportunity to have communication, but surely if anyone has a need and goes into the management office and presents that, there's an opportunity to sit down and work on it. That's what this one-size-fits-all policy took away. The opportunity to say, if you have a problem with rent, go in and speak to your manager. Now, initially it said, speak to your manager no more before the rent is due, no more than 7 days or 10 days after it's due, and work something out. Then it came out and said, well, you don't really have to do that, but and you really have to provide any evidence that it happened, that you have any impact. I don't know how you work problems out if you can't talk. And so I think that we have to really remember how important that communication is, because if you come in and you say my income is impacted, there are resources we can direct you to. And so we know that there's help for rent, help for food. How do we do that? You can't do it if you don't talk, if you create an adversarial relationship. Communication is absolutely the key.
I think that is, you know, it's going to be a real critical point of this conversation. You know, the business of housing people is a relationship business. Having been a developer and you know, part of a nonprofit, a community development corporation that's owned property before and worked with tenants, it's an absolute relationship. And I imagine that many of the really good landlords out there are very compassionate about the circumstances that people are in and are looking for ways to help them access the resources that you described, Jackie, so that they can continue to be able to sustain themselves. I want to just talk a bit about sort of the nuance here, and I'm hoping, Daniel, you can help me with this, Dan. So, you know, when it comes to where what it just so happens that you've got a tenant, you're communicating well, you've got that relationship, but frankly, they just don't have it because their hours have been cut, and they just, because of COVID-19, are not able to pay sort of the full rent. And you know, based on our collective understanding, there really aren't SBA products out there. The economic injury disaster loan does not qualify these kinds of small businesses to be able to access resources. Talk a little bit about that hardship and how important it is for us to really focus on renter relief efforts and efforts to sort of undergird some of our property owners.
Sure. And I just want to say I completely agree with what Jackie said and how key communication is. But I want to kind of level set it just a little bit, because Jackie is a professional manager and works for a company that has professional managers in place at their properties. And think about it from the perspective of a real small owner, which over 80% in California are, that own 10 or fewer units. And often you're dealing with a 75, sometimes 80-year-old apartment owner who is also very confused, like the renters are, and very scared about opening up lines of communication because they've heard that if they approach it in the wrong way, they can be accused of harassment and be in major legal liability. So it really is important to get the communication and help people understand the nuances of these, what have become very, very complicated eviction moratoriums. In terms of assistance for the small owner, and I've spoken to several dozens of them at this point, there really is not a lot of relief out there. Owners that may have Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac loans can apply for forbearances and mortgage relief, defer mortgage payments in some cases, but those lenders have been inundated, and the application process takes time, and those can be costly in terms of fees and added interest and things like that. And then the governor of California has come out and said that he has spoken to a number of lenders across the state. And what I've found is that there is a cost of getting some type of mortgage forbearance. It's unclear whether a small property owner would have their credit rating affected. And these types of forbearances are costly. There's legal costs, there's added interest oftentimes. And in the long run, I'm very, very concerned about what the appetite would be by lenders for lending to people in the apartment industry. And that would be a huge problem if suddenly the capital dried up for people that want to invest and own apartment buildings, because what we really need in the state is we need more housing, and this could add a huge bump in that road as we have much greater demand always for housing in the state. And if we can't build properties, or we can't sustain people that have taken the risk and made investments in these properties, we're going to have huge challenges. And there was really nothing under the CARES Act that was offered to apartment owners, nor was there any relief provided when we had to pay our property taxes by April 10th, or all of our business licenses back in February, before we were told that one of the major tools we have to ensure rent gets collected was being taken away from us. And we haven't seen any reductions in any city utilities, trash hauling fees, water. There really has been nothing offered that would be of any assistance to small owners and help them sustain themselves. And we have to remember that a lot of these small owners, while they have property, having equity in a property doesn't mean that you have liquidity. It's not always easy to tap into that liquidity. And I've talked to a number of owners that, and I, as I mentioned, I own an apartment building, but I also have a full-time job. And a lot of the apartment owners, just because they own an apartment doesn't mean that work hours haven't been cut, they haven't lost jobs. And I've spoken to a number who've come down with COVID-19, fortunately survived, but they've also had to care for a spouse or a family member that has been inflicted by it. So just like renters, apartment owners are all in the same boat, and without their rent and without their jobs, they're struggling to provide for their own housing and struggling to put food on their own tables. Everybody is being impacted.
Yeah, so Dan, what I want to do is go to some of the questions, because they're starting to build up in our queue, and I want to make sure that people get a chance to talk with the three of you while you're here. But you bring up some really good points, right? So, a lot of times, many of the folks who own rental properties don't have a lot of liquidity. They don't necessarily have a lot of cash that's sitting around that could cover some of the lost rent. To the extent that we understand that there are not a lot of resources, and thank you for reminding us about the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac backed mortgages. If you have those, then there is potentially some relief for you, but the majority of people may not have those. And if you don't, there isn't as obvious a source of relief. As cities and as policymakers, we might want to also think about some of the other costs that are borne by those who provide housing, such as you talked about trash, utilities, and other taxes, to try and see where we might be able to find a little wiggle room to help people out during this time. I'm going to ask my staff member, Emma Kloppenberg, if she would go ahead and pull up a couple of the questions that are floating around now. Emma?
Yes, thank you, Tanua. So I have one question around the framing of this conversation, going back to that, and how we can message this. So someone asks, telling people that they cannot be evicted, what they may hear is that they don't have to pay rent. How can this message be reshaped?
Yeah, Jackie, did you want to take that? I think we've started talking about it here. This is part of why we're raising this and having this conversation, is that we do believe that people are hearing that they don't have to pay rent. And really what we want people to hear is that they need to start a dialogue around what the income difference is that they're experiencing and what they can do. Anybody else want to be able to weigh in on that?
I really would like to, and thank you for that question, because it's a conversation that we need to have with those who have the bully pulpit and the mic. And so just the preamble that says, if you are affected, and then go into what the right is, as opposed to just starting in the middle. And that's extremely important. So every one of our elected officials needs to hear from us, especially those in areas where there are very strict dialogues. We also need to take advantage of the opportunity on our side to be proactive. And so I think when I say our side, I just mean the renting providers, because as Daniel and Andrea mentioned, we are not all the same either. So even as someone who provides affordable housing that we don't have any personal investment in, we are invested in making sure that our people can stay in place. So we have a common mission, make sure we provide it. So we need to get the word out and just say every opportunity we have. When there are the webinars that are sponsored by housing advocates, join in those dialogues, wade in, be a part of it so that our perspective is heard. But that preamble, if you are affected, is extremely important, and it's getting lost.
Let's get another question as well, Emma.
Yes. Someone else asked, is there any assistance or resources to ensure that facilities have the necessary resources to keep the property safe and disinfected for the virus? How are property managers protecting themselves as well to ensure that they are safe from possible infection from tenants?
I think that's an excellent question. Dan, do you have some thoughts about that? What's the future of our industry in being able to keep our staff safe as well as our tenants safe in environments where people have many, sort of public access points?
Well, unfortunately, it's a mixed bag, and I can't speak for everybody, but I do know that the larger professionally managed apartment complexes and communities are upping their cleaning protocols and requiring safety equipment, deferring, unnecessary maintenance, particularly when, residents are in unit, staying at home because they're working remotely or may have lost their jobs. So there has been a lot of information. And in fact, our association put out a COVID-19 resources page that has a FAQ sheet which addresses a lot of these issues. And it is definitely something that's being talked about. And we're putting word out through our different publications, social media, and in our printed magazine every month, just article after article about protocols people should follow and how they should be careful. Unfortunately for, the smaller buildings, there is, it could be a mixed bag because these owners aren't as actively engaged in their buildings. But I do know there is a lot of concern. We talk about it all the time with our members. And so people are trying to address it, as I said, through more frequent cleaning and providing information to their renters on, things that they should be careful about as well, including keeping a mask on and social distancing and washing hands frequently.
Dan, thank you so much.
If I could weigh in, I think a part of that question was, are there resources? And we have not found resources. We've been very appreciative for information that comes out from the Apartment Association and national groups, and working with staff to make sure staff is protected. One of the things we've done also is we very quickly accessed an opportunity for our staff to be tested. And we're now at the point where we're trying to provide testing as close as possible to home for our residents. But the resources to buy the extra disinfectants and it's not, there's nothing out there yet. But again, as our policymakers are trying to do major policy, and you can never get it right in the first setting, these are the kinds of things that need to be raised, because if it's happening here, it's happening across the country.
Excellent. So, Andrea, when we were in our talk and prepping for this call for today, one of the things that you wanted to make sure that people understood, I mean, you've mentioned it a few times over, that there are a whole lot of mom and pop owners out there who are living in their own properties. But you said you had a slight sort of variation on that mom and pop. Who's helping you, Andrea?
Andrea is helping Andrea because they're in the
So it's
moment.
it's just mom, you said, and no pop.
It's just mom, no pop. So I think that that's very important, for people to understand as we, as we engage in this dialogue that it's not, that it's just me and a lot of the women who are a part of our coalition, they're single women like myself. So that's very important to underscore as we have this dialogue.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that and for reminding us of that. So for this conversation, it doesn't look like I'm going to get to all of the questions, but I do want to make sure that we highlight some of the things that this panel has talked about. Communication as key. We certainly need to continue to have our relationships and make them strong between tenants and owners of property. Renter relief is still necessary because mortgages still have to get paid, and many of our small businesses don't qualify for a lot of the relief out there. To the extent that we can as cities, there are things that we can do to make sure that we are lowering the barriers of costs around trash, taxes, and utilities for those who are providing housing to those in our community. And it's going to be really important that we have some additional resources around making sure that we keep everyone informed on best ways to keep our facilities safe and clean in such a way that they are disinfectants, and really think about our property owners as frontline workers as well. On behalf of the entire LISC team and to our panelists today, talking about a call for data, as well as the new concerns and conditions of those who own properties in our community and are providing housing, we want to thank you for joining the LISC Los Angeles Supporting Small Businesses During COVID-19 Toolkit Conversation. Join us one more week next week, and shortly we will also be producing a toolkit specifically around housing and what's happening during this crisis. We'll see you next time, and thank you for joining us. Have a great day and be safe.
Thank you. You be safe.
Thank you. Stay well.